In the year 1767, a British slave ship named Lord Ligonier reached Annapolis Harbor in America. On this ship were 140 Africans who had been taken from their homes. During the terrible ocean journey, 42 of them died because of sickness, hunger, and the cruel conditions. Only 98 survived, and among them was a 17-year-old boy from the Mandinka people of West Africa. His real name was Kunta Kinte, a name that carried deep meaning in his culture. It meant complete or whole, a name given only to firstborn sons expected to protect family traditions. In official American records, this young man would later be written simply as Toby, a name forced on him. Those written records never mentioned where he came from, what his real name was, what values he carried, or what horrors he had survived. They didn't say how hard he fought to hold onto his identity. They only said that a slave was bought. But behind that one line in a ledger was a life that had already been torn apart by violence and greed. To understand how Kunta ended up on that ship, we must go back to his homeland in West Africa. The Gambia River was one of the main routes used by Europeans to take people from the continent. British traders built forts along the river, and from those places they bought or captured Africans to sell them in the Americas. By 1767, thousands had already passed through those stations. The British needed strong young men to work on tobacco farms in Virginia, so raiders searched villages to find boys like Kunta. Kunta came from a village called Juur, about 2 miles from a British fort. His people, the Kinte clan, were respected as blacksmiths and spiritual guides. They lived with constant fear of raids because different African groups, often forced by the Europeans, sometimes captured others for trade. Parents warned their children never to go too deep into the forest, never to walk alone, and always to be alert. Kunta's father, Amoro Kinte, had taught him the skills of drum-making and blacksmith work. These skills were not only cultural but also practical. His father believed that knowing how to make drums might help keep him alive if he was ever captured. Slave ships sometimes used African drummers to force people to dance for exercise, to keep them alive long enough to be sold. At 17, Kunta had completed his training as a young Mandinka man. He could hunt, knew his family history by heart, and carried the pride of his people. He was strong, skilled, and full of hopes for the future. No one in his village imagined how suddenly a life could change. One morning in July 1767, Kunta walked into the forest to gather wood for a drum. The path was familiar. He had walked it many times and felt safe. But hidden in the shadows were 4 raiders. They had been paid by British traders to capture young men, and they watched Kunta carefully. These raiders were experts in ambush. They attacked without warning, one blow from behind, hands covering his mouth, rope tied around his wrists, cloth pulled over his face. In less than 2 minutes, Kunta went from a free young man to a prisoner. The raiders dragged him miles away to a holding area near the river. Dozens of other Africans were trapped there, chained together. Some had been kept there for days, others for weeks. All of them looked shocked, confused, and terrified. They were treated like objects, fed little, and beaten if they cried out. The goal was to weaken their spirits before placing them on the ship. A few days later, the British sailors arrived to pick up the captives. A doctor checked each person the same way someone might inspect an animal. They looked at teeth, muscles, and bodies to decide who was fit enough to sell. 7 were rejected. Kunta, young, strong, and healthy, was accepted. He was now cargo. The small boats carried the prisoners to the huge ship waiting offshore. Many tried to jump into the water and drown themselves, but the sailors beat them until they obeyed. For the first time, Kunta saw the ship that would take him away forever. It was large, dark, and built to pack human beings into tiny spaces. When he was pushed below deck, he entered a world that seemed impossible to survive. The space below was only about the height of a sitting man. Each captive had barely enough room to lie down. They were chained by their ankles, connected to another person, so they couldn't move freely. The air was hot and dirty. The smell of fear, sweat, and sickness filled the space. Many prayed, many cried, and many simply stared, too shocked to understand what was happening. This was only the beginning of Kunta's long journey into darkness. A journey that would test his body, spirit, and identity again and again. Once Kunta was chained inside the slave ship, a new and even more terrifying chapter of his life began. The ship was not made for comfort or safety. It was built for profit. Every wooden beam, every narrow walkway, every iron chain was designed to pack in as many human beings as possible. The more people the traders could force onto the ship, the more money they would earn in America. Human lives were measured in coins, not compassion. The lower deck of the Lord Ligonier was the darkest and most suffocating place Kunta had ever seen. The ceiling was so low that no one could stand upright. The men were laid side by side, shoulder to shoulder, chained at their ankles in pairs. Kunta's right leg was fastened to the left leg of a man named Fanta, who came from another village far inland. They did not speak the same exact dialect, but they could understand enough to exchange simple words. The air below deck was thick and hot. Sweat dripped from everyone's bodies. There were no windows, only a few tiny holes cut into the wooden sides of the ship, and these barely allowed any fresh air to enter. The smell of sickness, fear, and unwashed bodies made breathing painful. The British sailors did not care about the suffering. They only cared that enough Africans stayed alive to be sold at a good price. Food was given once a day. It was a small mixture of beans or yams cooked into a mush and placed in a shared bucket. 10 men ate from the same container, using their hands or trying to lift the bucket toward their faces. Water came only twice a day. It was never enough. Thirst was constant, and the feeling made people desperate. Many whispered to themselves or cried softly, thinking of their families back home. Some prayed that the ship would sink so their misery could end. Disease spread quickly. Because everyone was chained, sick men could not move away, and healthy men could not escape the smell or the germs. Within the first week, fevers and stomach sickness moved through the rows of captives. Some men died quietly in the night. Others screamed until their strength gave out. The sailors removed the bodies only when they noticed the smell, or when another captive begged them to take the dead away. As the ship finally left the African coast, the sailors forced the captives onto the upper deck for short periods each day. They called it exercise, but it was really a way to keep the slaves alive long enough to sell. Still chained in pairs, the men were made to jump or walk, even while weak or dizzy. Sailors beat anyone who moved too slowly. To the sailors, this was not cruelty, it was routine. Kunta used these moments in the sunlight to observe everything he could. Even though he did not speak English, he listened carefully to the sailors' voices, trying to understand their patterns and behaviors. He watched how they moved around the ship, what tools they used, and how they reacted when the weather changed. His warrior training had taught him to observe small details and stay alert, and this skill became his quiet form of survival. Weeks passed, the endless ocean made time feel unreal, nights and days mixed together. Some captives lost track of who they were. Under so much trauma, memories faded. Men forgot their languages, their traditions, even the faces of their families. Kunta feared that this would happen to him too, that the ship would steal not only his freedom, but also his identity. To fight this, he started a ritual. Every morning during the short time on deck, he repeated his family line silently in his mind. I am Kunta Kinte, son of Amoro Kinte, grandson of Kairaba Kunta Kinte. He remembered his village, the smell of the soil, the sound of drums, the lessons his father taught him. Holding onto these memories was his way of resisting. He believed that as long as he remembered who he was, the captors could not fully own him. Halfway through the voyage, a terrible storm struck. The ship rocked violently as huge waves crashed over it. The captives below deck had nowhere to escape. Water poured through openings, mixing with waste on the floor. People slipped, screamed, and prayed. The ship tilted with such force that bodies rolled across the deck, slamming into chains and wooden beams. Some died from injuries, others died from fear and exhaustion. When the storm finally passed after several days, the sailors threw the dead into the ocean. The remaining captives were too weak to cry. They had lost friends, brothers, and strangers who had become like family through shared suffering. Kunta watched all of this with a heavy heart. He felt pain, fear, and sadness, but his spirit did not give in. Even in the darkness, he held on to one truth. He was still himself. His name, his memories, and his identity were the only things the slave traders could not take, unless he allowed them to fade. After nearly 11 weeks at sea, land finally appeared on the horizon. For many captives it brought relief, but for Kunta it brought a new fear, because he understood that once the ship reached shore, a different kind of nightmare would begin. After nearly 11 weeks on the ocean, the Lord Ligonier finally reached land. The ship entered the harbor of Annapolis, a busy port where many slave ships arrived during those years. For the captives, this moment felt strange. On one hand, they were relieved to feel the ship stop moving after so many weeks of rocking and suffering. But on the other hand, none of them knew what awaited them. They were stepping into a new world where they understood neither the language nor the customs. When the ship anchored, officials came aboard to check the cargo. To them, the Africans were not people with families and histories. They were counted like boxes or bags of goods. One by one, the captives were unchained and brought to the upper deck. Their eyes blinked painfully in the bright sunlight after so many days in dark, airless space. The sailors washed the captives roughly, not out of kindness but to make them look more presentable for sale. Kunta felt weak and exhausted, yet his mind stayed alert. He looked around at the harbor. The buildings were nothing like the round mud homes of his village. The air was colder. White people filled the docks, talking loudly and pointing at the Africans. Some had come only to watch, some to buy, and some out of curiosity. For the first time, Kunta realized that he and the others were not simply unwanted prisoners. They were considered valuable objects to these strangers. A public announcement soon spread through Annapolis. A notice in the local newspaper read, "Just imported from the river Gambia, a cargo of choice, healthy slaves." Those words hid the truth. The captives were not choice or healthy. They were survivors of hunger, disease, storms, and unimaginable fear. Yet to the slave buyers, only the number of survivors mattered. Within days of their arrival, the Africans were prepared for auction. The sale was held in a public space where buyers gathered to examine each captive. Men lifted the Africans' arms, looked into their mouths, checked their muscles, and asked questions the captives could not understand. It was humiliating, frightening, and deeply painful. Kunta kept repeating his name silently in his mind, trying to hold on to something of himself during this degrading process. The buyers came mostly from tobacco plantations in Virginia. Tobacco farming needed strong labor because the work was tough and stretched from early morning to sunset. Owners preferred young men like Kunta because they could be forced to work for decades. Kunta's strong body made him highly valuable to these buyers who didn't see the frightened young man, only a worker they could exploit. Among the buyers that day was John Waller, a plantation owner from Spotsylvania County in Virginia. He needed new slaves because some of his older ones had died or become too weak to keep up with the hard farm work. When he saw Kunta, he noticed the strength in his shoulders, the firmness of his muscles, and the alertness in his eyes. Instead of recognizing Kunta's spirit, Waller saw only a strong body that would bring profit. The auctioneer shouted numbers, and men raised their hands to bid. The process was fast and loud. Kunta did not understand the words, but he understood what was happening. He was being sold like an object. Eventually, John Waller won the bid. In a few minutes, Kunta became the legal property of another man. On paper, the record said, one Negro male, approximately 17 years old. It did not say, a young warrior taken from his village, a son loved by his parents, a boy with dreams and memories. After the sale, John Waller prepared to take Kunta and a few other purchased captives to his plantation. They were loaded onto a wagon like goods being transported. During the 3-day journey to Virginia, they were given only small amounts of food and water. This harsh treatment was not accidental. It was part of the system. Slave owners believed that treating newly bought Africans roughly would break their spirits early, making them easier to control. Along the road, Kunta tried to study the surroundings, counting trees, watching the direction of the sun, and remembering paths. But everything was unfamiliar: the plants, the weather, the roads, even the animals. He was thousands of miles away from his homeland. During the journey, Waller tried teaching the captives a few English words: work, stop, food, sleep. These were words connected only to labor and obedience. There were no words like family, freedom, or home. Kunta's language had rhythm and tone that carried emotion. English felt flat and harsh to him, like a tool used for commands rather than communication. When they finally reached Waller's plantation, the enslaved community quietly watched the new arrivals. They knew from experience that every newcomer carried a story of pain, and each one changed the balance of life on the plantation. Some wondered if Kunta would survive the harsh rules. Others wondered if he would fight back. The first thing John Waller did was give each newly bought slave a new name. To him, African names were too strange and too connected to the captives' past lives. He believed that stripping someone of their name would make them easier to control. So he pointed at Kunta and said, "You will be called Toby." The name felt like an insult, like being erased. Kunta had already lost his freedom, his homeland, and his family. Losing his name would mean losing the last piece of himself. So when Waller's overseer repeated, "Your name is Toby," Kunta shook his head and said proudly, "Kunta Kinte." This moment marked the beginning of a long and painful battle between one man's identity and a system built to crush it. Kunta was now on the plantation, but his spirit had not been broken, and his name would become the first thing he fought to protect. When Kunta arrived at the Waller plantation, he entered a world built on strict rules, harsh punishments, and complete control. Life on an American plantation was not only about physical labor. It was also about breaking a person's spirit so completely that he would no longer think of himself as a free human being. This was the world Kunta now stepped into. John Waller owned dozens of enslaved men, women, and children. These people had different origins. Some were born in Africa like Kunta, while others were born in America and had never seen their ancestral homeland. The American-born slaves spoke English, understood the rules of the plantation, and knew when to stay quiet to avoid punishment. For them, survival meant keeping their heads down and doing what the overseer demanded. The overseer on Waller's plantation was a man named Connolly. He believed that fear was the best tool for control. He spoke harshly, carried a whip, and punished people quickly for the smallest mistakes. When he first approached Kunta, he pointed to him and repeated the name Waller had assigned, Toby. The expectation was simple: Kunta must repeat the name to show obedience. But Kunta refused. With firmness in his voice, he said, "Kunta Kinte." Connolly frowned. He thought Kunta simply didn't understand English, so he said the name again, louder, "Toby." Kunta repeated once more, "Kunta Kinte." This simple act, saying his true name, was the first and strongest form of resistance Kunta could offer. It reminded him who he was. It reminded him that before being brought to America, he had been a son, a student, a young man with ancestry and pride. Giving up his name meant giving up everything. Connolly responded in the only way he knew, through violence. He struck Kunta across the face. Still, Kunta repeated his real name. The overseer struck him harder. The same result. This pattern continued for days. Every time someone called him Toby, Kunta responded with Kunta Kinte. The punishment came again and again, but the name remained the same. Other enslaved people watched with mixed emotions. Some admired his courage because he was doing what they wished they could have done when they first arrived. Others were afraid his resistance would bring harsher treatment on everyone. Still, deep inside, two feelings grew among the enslaved community: respect and hope. Watching someone refuse to break reminded them that they too once had identities, families, and lives beyond the plantation. An older enslaved man named Fiddler approached Kunta one day. Fiddler had lived in Virginia for decades. He was African-born, but the long years of slavery had forced him to adapt to the plantation system. He understood both African traditions and the way white men enforced their authority. With patience and worry in his eyes, he tried to tell Kunta that refusing the slave name would only bring more suffering. "Do what they say in front of them," Fiddler advised softly, "but keep who you are inside." But Kunta could not accept this. For him, the name was not just a word. It was his father's blessing, his ancestors' history, and the last piece of his freedom. To let go of his name was to let the slavers win completely, so he continued to say it every time. Finally, John Waller himself decided the punishment had to be stronger. He ordered Kunta to be tied to a post in front of the entire enslaved community. Everyone was forced to watch. Waller believed that breaking Kunta publicly would send a message to everyone else. Resistance would be defeated. The whipping began. Each strike tore into Kunta's back. The pain was extreme, but Kunta still refused to say the false name. After each lash, Waller would ask, "What is your name?" And each time, Kunta used what strength he had to say, "Kunta Kinte." Waller raised the punishment to the point where Kunta eventually fainted from the agony. Many watching felt both fear and shock. Fear of what the white men could do, and shock that despite everything, Kunta never gave in. His silence was his shield. His refusal was his victory. When Kunta woke again, he was lying among other enslaved people who carefully wiped his wounds with water. Their eyes showed deep respect. They had witnessed something powerful, someone holding on to his identity even under torture. Some quietly whispered his name to themselves, almost as if reminding their own spirits not to forget. As Kunta healed, he was placed in the tobacco fields. Field work was difficult and required long hours under the sun. The tasks were new to him, and he made mistakes often. The overseer punished him again and again, but over time, Kunta learned the tasks through careful observation. His training back in Juur, where he learned to pay attention to details, now helped him survive. He watched how others planted, weeded, and harvested. Slowly, he mastered the work enough to avoid constant punishment. Still, the struggle with the false name continued. Whenever Waller tested him by saying, "Toby," Kunta either stayed silent or whispered his real name under his breath. This quiet refusal was now his new form of resistance. He could not fight the overseer. He could not escape yet, but he could hold on to his identity. Over the months, Kunta's presence changed the enslaved community. His courage reminded others that they were more than property. He showed that even when a person's body is controlled, the mind can remain free. Though the plantation owners didn't realize it, Kunta's quiet strength inspired those around him. By the end of his first year on the plantation, Kunta had survived more pain and punishment than most people could imagine. But something important remained untouched: his sense of self. He was still Kunta Kinte, a Mandinka man from Juur, the son of Omoro. His captors had taken his land, his freedom, and his future, but his name, his last gift from home, still belonged to him. And this refusal, simple as it was, would shape the rest of his life. As the seasons changed and months passed on the Waller plantation, Kunta continued to work in the tobacco fields. His body grew used to the long days, but his heart never accepted the life forced on him. Every swing of the hoe, every command from the overseer, every harsh word reminded him that he was living a life meant to crush him. Yet deep inside, one thought burned steadily: freedom. Winter in Virginia was very different from the warm climate Kunta knew in Africa. The cold cut through his thin clothing, and many enslaved people became sick. Some even died because the quarters were poorly built, letting freezing air pass through the wooden walls. Kunta struggled through the winter, shivering at night and watching people around him suffer. He realized more clearly than ever that staying on the plantation meant years of pain, hunger, and possible death. By the time the harsh winter months settled in, Kunta had begun to think seriously about escaping. He had little knowledge of the land around him, no map, and no real idea how far Africa was. But he believed that running, even without a perfect plan, was better than living and dying as a slave. His warrior training had taught him that a man should fight for his freedom, even if the chances were small. His first opportunity came when the overseer, Connolly, left the plantation for several days to visit family. The person in temporary charge was less strict and less observant. Kunta noticed that at night, the guards barely checked the quarters after the first round. He also noticed a loose door at the back of the slave cabin, something the overseer had never bothered to fix. One cold night, after everyone had gone quiet, Kunta quietly slipped out through that broken door. The air was sharp, and the ground was frozen beneath his bare feet. He carried no weapon, no food except for a few scraps he had hidden earlier, and no warm clothing. But he carried hope, and for the moment that was enough. He moved through the trees, following a small creek that he hoped would lead him somewhere safe. Every shadow felt dangerous, every crack of a branch made his heart pound. He tried to stay silent, knowing that slave-catcher dogs could pick up the slightest sound or scent. For the first few hours, fear and courage mixed inside him, pushing him forward. But before dawn, distant barking broke the quiet. Kunta froze. The dogs were coming. Slave catchers in Virginia were known for their brutal efficiency. They used trained hounds that could follow scent trails for miles. Once those dogs found you, escape was nearly impossible. Kunta tried to run, but the freezing ground cut into his feet. His thin clothes offered no protection. The barking grew louder, closer. Within minutes, the slave catcher and his assistants appeared. The dogs circled Kunta, growling. The men moved in, tying his hands and placing a rope around his neck. He had no strength left to resist. They dragged him back toward the plantation, parading him along the main road so that others would see. This was not just punishment. It was a warning to every enslaved person. If you run, we will catch you, and you will suffer. Kunta walked in silence, his head held high despite the pain. He refused to show fear. When they returned to the plantation, John Waller and Connolly were waiting. The beating that followed was unlike the earlier ones. This punishment was meant to break Kunta physically and mentally. He was tied to the same post where his name had once been beaten out of him. This time Waller demanded only one thing, that Kunta promise never to run again. Kunta refused. He didn't shout. He didn't fight verbally. He simply stayed silent. His silence angered Waller more than words ever could. So the beating continued until Kunta lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was in a small shed, alone, weak and barely able to move. The pain in his body was deep, but the idea of freedom still flickered in his mind. Even punishment could not extinguish it. Months passed, Kunta healed. He returned to work in the fields, but the overseers watched him more closely. Many enslaved people whispered to him quietly, offering food or emotional support. Though Kunta rarely spoke about his escape attempt, everyone knew, and quietly many admired him. But Kunta was not finished trying. By the next spring, he attempted a second escape, this time with more planning. He stole bits of food over several weeks, hid them, and waited for the right moment. When he ran the second time, he managed to stay hidden for nearly 3 days. His English had improved enough to pretend he was running an errand for a white man, which helped him avoid suspicion for a short time. But once again, the dogs found him. Once again, the slave catcher dragged him back. But this time, the punishment was far more severe. Repeated escape attempts were deeply feared by slave owners. A slave who tried to run twice signaled to others that resistance was possible. Slave owners wanted to crush that hope immediately. So John Waller made a decision that would change Kunta's life permanently. He ordered that half of Kunta's right foot be cut off. The punishment was both brutal and common in that era. The idea was simple. A slave who could not run fast could not escape. Dr. Waller, John Waller's brother, performed the amputation. There was no anesthesia. The pain was beyond anything Kunta had ever experienced. It was not just a physical injury. It was a message. Freedom is impossible. For weeks, Kunta lay recovering. The enslaved people cared for him gently, bringing him water, wiping his wounds, and offering quiet comfort. Kunta felt deep despair, not because of the injury itself, but because he now knew escape was physically impossible. But even in this dark moment, one thing remained untouched: his identity, his name, his sense of self. The slavers had taken his foot, but they had not taken his spirit. After the amputation of half of his right foot, Kunta entered one of the darkest periods of his life. The physical pain was unbearable. The cut was deep, raw, and constantly burning. Every small movement sent shockwaves through his leg, but even worse was the emotional weight. The realization that his ability to run, his strongest hope for freedom, had been taken from him in a single violent act. For many days, Kunta drifted in and out of consciousness. Fever came and went. Infection was a constant danger. The enslaved community took turns caring for him because they understood that if Kunta died, it would be a loss not just of a person but of their symbol of courage. They cleaned his wound gently, brought him food, and whispered prayers or comforting words. Some touched his shoulder softly, letting him know they were there. Their quiet care reminded Kunta that he was not alone, even in suffering. Fiddler, the older man who had tried earlier to guide him, stayed by his side most nights. He would tell stories in a soft voice, stories of Africa, of memories that he himself barely remembered, but still held close. He told Kunta, "Your spirit's strong, boy. They can't take that." These words reached Kunta's heart in a way few things did during that painful time. Weeks later, as the wound slowly began to close, Kunta tried to sit up for the first time. The pain shot through him, but he forced himself to keep going. In his mind, lying helpless forever was not an option. He needed to heal. He needed to stand again, even if he could not run. He needed to find some purpose, some way to survive without losing himself. The plantation owners, of course, had no sympathy. To them, Kunta was still property that needed to be put to use. Since he could no longer walk long distances or work effectively in the fields, they had to find a job that matched his limited mobility. John Waller discussed it with his brother, Dr. Waller, who suggested that Kunta could be trained for carriage work or stable duties. These tasks required less walking and more upper body strength, which Kunta still had plenty of. When Kunta was finally well enough to stand with support, the overseer brought him to the stables. At first, the sharp smell of hay, horses, and manure overwhelmed him. But slowly he learned the tasks: brushing horses, cleaning stalls, filling water buckets, and repairing small items. It took effort to move around on his injured foot, and each step reminded him of what he had lost. Yet the work gave him something he desperately needed: routine, purpose, and a chance to rebuild his strength. Over time, Kunta became more skilled. He could tell when a horse was frightened, when it needed rest, or when something was wrong with its hooves. Animals responded to him gently, almost sensing his pain and calm nature. Working with the horses gave him a rare sense of peace, a quiet corner of life where no overseer stood over him every second. Even so, Kunta never forgot that this peace existed within a system of cruelty. Fiddler continued to be his guide and friend. He taught Kunta more English so he could understand orders and avoid unnecessary punishment. Sometimes they spoke in hushed voices about Africa. Fiddler encouraged him to stay alive, saying survival itself was a form of resistance. "If you die, they win," he would say. "If you live, your story lives too." Kunta listened. Though he still felt anger, he also felt a new kind of clarity. He realized that freedom did not always look the same. At first, freedom meant running back to Africa. Now, with his foot gone, that dream seemed impossible. But maybe freedom could take a new form, keeping his identity alive, refusing to bend his mind even if his body could not escape. Slowly, Kunta learned to walk with a slight limp. At first he leaned heavily on a stick, but with time he could move without it, though awkwardly. The plantation children sometimes mocked him for his limp, but he ignored them. His injury was a reminder of his courage, not his weakness. As months turned into years, Kunta became more stable in his role. He learned to harness horses, repair carriages, and handle driving tasks. These skills made him valuable in a new way, not as a field laborer but as someone responsible for transportation. Sometimes he would drive Waller's carriage into the nearby town. These short trips gave Kunta a small taste of the outside world beyond the plantation's borders. He noticed the roads, counted distances, studied the land, old habits of alertness that never left him. Most importantly, Kunta continued to hold on to his name. Even if the plantation owners called him Toby, the people in the quarters called him Kunta. With Fiddler especially, he felt seen as himself. The bond between them grew stronger, almost like father and son. Fiddler taught him ways to survive mentally, how to navigate dangers, and how to protect the small part of himself the slavers could not touch. One quiet night, as Kunta looked at the stars, he remembered how back in Juur he had learned to read the sky for direction. Those memories stung because they reminded him of a life lost forever. But instead of breaking him, the memories strengthened him. They reminded him that he came from a proud people, that he had survived the unimaginable, and that despite everything, he was still Kunta Kinte. By the end of this period, Kunta had changed. He was no longer the newly captured boy full of panic, nor the desperate runner ready to risk everything. He was now a man who had endured pain, loss, and the hardest lessons life could give. Yet he had kept his identity, his strength, and his dignity alive. The slavers had reshaped his body, but they had not reshaped his soul. As more years passed on the Waller plantation, Kunta's life slowly began to change in ways he never expected. The wounds on his foot had healed, leaving a permanent limp, but his inner strength remained firm. He had learned how to survive in the stables, how to avoid unnecessary conflict, and how to protect the small circle of dignity he had built around himself. Yet something was still missing: connection, companionship, and a sense of belonging in a world that constantly tried to erase who he was. During this time, Kunta began to notice a young woman named Belle. She worked inside the Waller household as a cook and helper. Belle was quick with her movements, sharp with her tongue when needed, and full of quiet wisdom. She had grown up on the plantation and knew every rule, every danger, and every unspoken truth about survival. While Kunta mostly stayed quiet around others, Belle had a way of bringing out feelings he kept locked inside. Their first conversations were simple, sharing food, exchanging comments about the weather, talking about the overseer's mood. But little by little, their talks grew deeper. Belle was one of the few people who treated Kunta not like a broken man or a dangerous stranger, but like someone worth understanding. She respected his silence, his pride, and even his stubbornness. Belle also carried her own pain. She had lost people she loved, watched others sold away, and learned how to endure a system designed to tear families apart. Through all of this, she remained strong. Her strength was different from Kunta's. His was fiery and rooted in identity. Hers was patient and rooted in wisdom. Together, these strengths began to balance each other. During quiet nights, Belle would sometimes sit with Kunta outside the quarters. She asked him about Africa, about his home, about the people he once lived with. Kunta spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, describing the river, the forests, the drums, and the traditions he still remembered. Belle listened with deep interest, imagining a world far beyond the fences of the plantation. One night, she said softly, "You come from a place that sounds like freedom." Kunta replied, "You come from strength." It was that simple exchange that marked the beginning of something new between them. Over time, the two grew closer. The enslaved community saw their connection and quietly supported them. For enslaved people, forming bonds was an act of hope. Marriage was not legally recognized under slavery, but a ceremony of the heart, a commitment made before witnesses, held powerful meaning. It meant claiming humanity in a place designed to strip it away. When Kunta and Belle decided to join their lives, the community came together at night. They surrounded the couple, humming soft songs and offering blessings. There were no rings, no legal papers, no freedom, but there was love, respect, and a shared belief that even in chains, life could grow. Kunta felt something he had not felt in years: belonging. Marriage brought stability and a sense of emotional safety. Belle pushed Kunta to keep learning English so they could communicate more easily, but she never forced him to let go of Mandinka traditions. In return, Kunta taught Belle small bits of his language, small stories of his ancestors, and quiet lessons about the dignity he carried from his homeland. Their bond helped Kun to adjust to plantation life in a healthier way. He still refused to be called Toby, and Belle supported him in this quietly. She understood that his name was the core of who he was, and she never used the slave name. Instead, she called him Kunta, speaking it with pride, as if keeping the name alive in the air itself. One of the most important moments of their life together happened when Belle became pregnant. When she told Kunta, a mixture of joy and fear washed over him. The idea of bringing a child into a world of slavery scared him deeply, but he also felt hope, a spark that perhaps through his child, something of him, something of Africa, something of freedom would survive. During the pregnancy, Belle received support from older women on the plantation who had delivered many babies. They offered herbs, advice, and comfort. Kunta tried to help in whatever ways he could, bringing extra firewood, helping Belle move around, or sitting beside her when she felt unwell. For the first time since coming to America, he felt responsible for a future generation, his own bloodline. When their daughter was finally born, she arrived healthy and strong. Belle held her close, tears in her eyes, while Kunta watched in awe. He had never seen anything as pure or hopeful. They named her Kizzy, which meant stay put, or stay put where you belong. The name carried deep meaning. For Kunta, it was a way of saying he hoped his daughter would stay connected to her roots, her strength, and her identity, no matter where life took her. Raising Kizzy brought joy into their lives. Kunta would hum Mandinka rhythms to her as she slept. He told her stories of his homeland, even though she was too young to understand. He wanted her to grow up knowing that her father came from a proud people. Belle taught her how to survive in the harsh world of the plantation, how to avoid the overseer's attention, how to stay safe, and how to navigate daily chores. Their family life was simple, but it was filled with love, resilience, and moments of quiet happiness. Every smile from Kizzy reminded Kunta that his bloodline had survived everything thrown at him: the capture, the ship, the torture, the amputation, and the years of oppression. Even though the world around them was cruel, their small family was a place of warmth. It gave Kunta something he had not felt since childhood, a reason to keep living, not just surviving. He found new purpose as a father. He realized that although he might never return to Africa, he could pass Africa on through his stories, his name, and his strength. In this period, Kunta learned something vital. Even in the darkest systems, love can grow. Even in a world designed to break people, families can form. And even in chains, a man can still protect a piece of himself and pass it on to the next generation. As the years passed, Kunta grew into an older man. His limp became more noticeable, and the pain in his leg increased during cold seasons. But even as his body aged, his spirit remained firm. He had survived the unimaginable and had built a small circle of love around himself: Belle, their daughter Kizzy, and the community of enslaved people who respected him deeply. His life had taken a path he never chose, yet he shaped that life with dignity, strength, and identity. Kizzy grew into a bright and curious child. From the beginning, she carried traits from both her parents: Belle's wisdom and Kunta's courage. Kunta took great care to teach her small pieces of Mandinka culture. He taught her words, rhythms, and stories he had memorized from his youth in Juur. Even though they were far from Africa, he wanted Kizzy to feel connected to her roots. He whispered to her, "Never forget who you are." As she grew older, Kizzy learned to read people, understand danger, and survive the harsh reality around her. She helped her mother with chores in the house and often spent time with Kunta in the stables. She watched him work with horses and listened to the gentle way he talked to them. Sometimes she would ask him questions about Africa, questions that filled him with both pride and sadness. Pride because he came from a beautiful land. Sadness because he knew he would never return. Despite all the hardship, this period of Kunta's life carried moments of real happiness. Watching his daughter grow gave him hope that even within the walls of slavery, a piece of him could live freely through her spirit. Belle, wise and steady, held the family together, guiding them through each day with quiet strength. But life under slavery was never stable. It could change in one moment. When Kizzy reached her teenage years, she was known across the plantation for her intelligence and skill. She learned to read secret messages, help others, and carry news between enslaved people. Her father's fire lived strongly in her. This strength, however, brought danger. One day, Kizzy helped a young man named Noah attempt an escape by forging a travel pass. Though her intention was only to help someone gain freedom, the risk was enormous. When the forgery was discovered, the punishment fell upon her with full force. The Wallers decided to sell Kizzy away to another plantation. It happened quickly before Belle or Kunta could process the shock. One morning, a trader arrived. By afternoon, Kizzy was torn away from her parents. Her screams, Belle's cries, and Kunta's devastated silence filled the yard. Kunta tried to run to her, but his limp and age made it impossible. The desperation in his eyes was something the entire plantation never forgot. It was the second time in his life that chains took away someone he loved. But this time the pain was deeper. Losing his daughter, not to death but to the cruelty of slavery, felt like losing a part of his soul. He stood helplessly, watching the wagon carry her away, disappearing down the dusty road. The grief was unbearable. For days, Kunta did not speak. Belle stayed close to him, holding on to him, reminding him that their daughter was still alive somewhere, carrying their love with her. Slowly, Kunta returned to work, though he moved with a heaviness that had never been there before. Yet even in this darkest moment, something important survived. Kizzy remembered everything he had taught her, her name, her roots, her pride, her strength, and she carried those lessons forward into her own life. Though she faced her own suffering on the new plantation, she never forgot she was Kunta Kinte's daughter. Years later, Kizzy had a son named Chicken George, who grew up hearing his grandfather's stories passed through his mother. George carried Kunta's fire, charm, and strength. Through George, the Kinte legacy continued, and from George came more generations, each one carrying a piece of the man who refused to forget his name. Kunta lived long enough to see signs that his legacy was alive. Though he never saw Kizzy again, he knew her spirit had not been broken. Sometimes he would sit under the trees, close his eyes, and imagine her grown, teaching her own children the things he had once taught her. Toward the end of his life, Kunta spent more time sharing stories with younger enslaved people. He told them stories of Africa, of the Mandinka traditions, of his youth, of his parents, and of his journey. These stories reminded them that they came from proud ancestors. They were not just property. They were human beings with roots, history, and dignity. As his body grew weak, Kunta continued to repeat the words that had carried him through everything. "My name is Kunta Kinte." To some, he was an old man with a limp. To others, especially the young ones, he was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even when the world tries to erase you, you can hold onto your identity. When Kunta finally passed away, he left behind more than memories. He left behind a story of endurance, suffering, pride, and unbroken identity. His life became a thread running through generations, shaping families long after his own heart stopped beating. Belle and the community honored him in quiet ways. They spoke his name softly, they shared his stories, they taught the children about the man who refused to be called by a slave name, and in that way, his spirit continued to travel through time. Kunta Kinte never returned to Africa, but Africa lived in him and he passed it on. His journey, marked by pain and courage, became a legacy stronger than chains, and in the generations that came after him, through Kizzy, through Chicken George, through countless descendants, Kunta's name lived on, refusing to fade, refusing to be lost. This was the victory the slavers could never undo. This was the final triumph of a man who held on to his identity until the very end.